What does it really mean to be a leftist in the early part of the 21st century? What are we really talking about? And I can just be very candid with you. It means to have a certain kind of temperament, to make certain kinds of political and ethical choices, and to exercise certain analytical focuses and targeting on the catastrophic and the monstrous, the scandalous, the traumatic that are often hidden and concealed in the deodorized and manicured discourses of the mainstream. That's what it means to be a leftist. So let's just be clear about it. So that if you were concerned about structural violence, if you're concerned about exploitation at the workplace, if you're concerned about institutionalized contempt against gay brothers and lesbian sisters, if you're concerned about organized hatred against peoples of color, if you're concerned about the subordination of women, that's not cheap PC chit-chat. That is a calling that you're willing to fight against and try to understand the sources of that social misery at the structural and institutional level and at the existential and the personal level. That's what it means in part to be a leftist. That's why we choose to be certain kinds of human beings. That's why it's a calling, not a career. It's a vocation, not a profession. That's why you see these veterans still here year after year after year, because they are convinced they don't want to live in a world and they don't want to be human in such a way that they don't exercise their intellectual and political and social and cultural resources in some way to leave the world just a little better than it was when they entered. That's in part what it means to be a leftist.
And the activism did civilize the country. It's an important achievement. The country's a lot more civilized than it was 40 years ago, and the historic achievements illustrate it. And that's also a lesson for what's next. What's next will depend on whether the same thing happens. Changes and progress very rarely are gifts from above. They come out of struggles from below. And it's up to the answer to what's next depends on people like you. Nobody else can answer it. It's not predictable. About 80% say the government does not work for the benefit of the people. It works for the few and the special interests. Startling 94% complain that the government doesn't pay any attention to the public will, and on like that. Under conditions like that, you'd expect a landslide for the opposition, almost whoever they are. And there wasn't one, which does raise some questions. So one might ask why there wasn't a landslide, and that goes off in an interesting direction. There is the distribution of funding has, over time, been a pretty good predictor of what policies will be like. For those of you who are interested, there's very good scholarly work on this by Tom Ferguson at UMass Boston, what he calls the investment theory of politics, which predicts which argues essentially that elections are moments when groups of investors coalesce and invest to control the state, and has quite substantial predictive success, gives some suggestion as to what's likely to happen. So that part's familiar. What the future is, as I say, depends on people like you. That's a victory for democracy, when popular movements can organize and set programs and pick their candidate and put them into office, which is not what happened here, of course. When Obama did organize a large number of people, and many enthusiastic people, what's called in the press Obama's army, but the army is supposed to take instructions, not to implement, to introduce, develop programs and call on its own candidate to implement them. That's critical. If the Army keeps to that condition, nothing much will change. If it, on the other hand, goes the way activists did in the 60s, a lot could change. One of the choices that has to be made. The public relations industry, which runs elections here, quadrennial extravaganzas, essentially. Make sure to keep issues in the margins and focus on personalities, character, and so on and so forth. They do that for good reasons. They know, they look at public opinion studies, and they know perfectly well that on a host of major issues, both parties are well to the right of the population. That's one good reason to keep issues off the table. And they recognize the success. So a couple of days, every year, the advertising industry gives a prize to the best marketing campaign of the year. This year, Obama won the prize, beat out Apple Company, the best marketing campaign of 2008, which is correct. That's essentially what happened. Now that's quite different from what happens in a functioning democracy, like, say, Bolivia or Haiti, except for the fact that it was crushed. And in the South, it's not all that uncommon. The question is, what is a democracy supposed to be? That's actually a debate that goes back to the Constitutional Convention. But in recent years, say in the 20th century, it's been pretty well articulated by important figures. So at the liberal end, progressive end, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century was Walter Lippmann, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, progressive. And a lot of his work was on a democratic theory, and he was pretty frank about it. He actually took a position not all that different from James Madison's. He said that in a democracy, the population has a function. Its function is to be spectators, not participants. A function, namely to watch what's going on, and to push a lever every once in a while, and then go home. But the participants are us privileged, smart guys. Well, that's one conception of democracy, and yeah, that's essentially, we've seen an episode of it. The population very often doesn't accept this. As I mentioned in just very recent polls, people overwhelmingly oppose it. But they're atomized, separated. Many of them feel hopeless, unorganized, and don't feel they can do anything about it. So they dislike it, but that's where it ends. In a functioning democracy, like, say, Bolivia or the United States in earlier stages, they did something about it. That's why we have the New Deal measures, the Great Society measures. In fact, just about any step, women's rights, end of slavery, go back as far as you like. It doesn't happen as a gift, and it's not going to happen in the future. Choose which kind of democracy we want, and again, that'll determine what comes next. That the institutions that run the elections, the public relations industry, advertisers, they have a role. Their major role is commercial advertising. I mean, selling a candidate is a kind of a side role. In commercial advertising, as everybody knows, everybody who's ever, say, looked at a television program, the advertising is not intended to provide information about the product, right? I mean, I don't have to go on about that, it's obvious. The point of the advertising is to delude people with imagery and, tales of a football player, or a sexy actress who, drives to the moon in a car or something like that. But it's certainly not to inform people. In fact, it's to keep people uninformed. The goal of advertising is to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. Those of you who've suffered through an economics course know that markets are supposed to be based on informed consumers making rational choices. But industry spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year to undermine markets and to ensure that you get uninformed consumers making irrational choices. And when they turn to selling a candidate, they do the same thing. They want uninformed consumers, uninformed voters, to make irrational choices based on the success of illusion, slander, invective, body language, or whatever else is supposed to be significant. So you undermine democracy pretty much the same way you undermine markets.
that if we've learned one thing from those perilous years, it's that dogma, certainty, self-righteousness, sectarianism of all kinds is dangerous and self-defeating. So to me, the rhythm that we've tried to live our lives by and that we urge on our students and others is open your eyes, see the world as it really is, act, take some action within the world, engage, and then importantly, and something we forgot to do in 1970, doubt. Act and then doubt. Question yourself, what did you do right? What did you do wrong? And then act again. So that rhythm of opening your eyes, seeing the world, acting, doubting, it seems to me is what ought to power us forward.
I want to add one last thing. The best of the New Left and the best of the social struggles of today have at their core the valuing of human life, all human life. You have to say both parts of that because the people have to find our place in the world. We have to live differently. We have to live, and I say this with all humility too, you know, we have to all together learn to live differently so that others may live. And so that core notion that animates social justice movements is really the valuing of all human life.